al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State, especially the Islamic State, came into...
It's the war on drugs becoming the war on terror. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm Cully Stimson, your incoming editor-in-chief of the National Security Law Journal. The National Security Law Journal is the country's premier journal on national security law, advancing the dynamic field of national security law, including topics related to foreign affairs, intelligence, homeland security, and national defense, with informative and innovative commentary on a wide variety of issues pertaining to national security law and policy. With this mission in mind, we host 2 symposiums to encourage academic scholarship and discourse surrounding pressing national security issues. Since the Reagan administration, the war on drugs has been deeply associated with the Republican Party. As time progresses and administrations change, so do the attitudes towards drug policy and tactics to counter the drug epidemic in the United States. One factor contributing to drug problems remains consistent: transnational drug cartels. On February 20th, President Trump made an unprecedented move with the release of Executive Order 14157, which designates drug cartels and other transnational organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. One major effect of the executive order is that this designation gives the president the authority to exercise the armed forces against drug cartels. This leaves one question looming among national security communities. Is the war on drugs becoming the war on terror? To discuss this question, NSLJ is teaming up with the National Security Institute. NSI is dedicated to strengthening American national security and U.S. local leadership by educating future leaders and advancing actionable solutions based on practical experience. NSI champions intellectual and personal diversity as a crest to a well-informed society and foreign policy, and also as a key attribute for developing the next generation of national security leaders, many of whom are in this room with us today. With that, I would like to turn the floor over to our moderator. He is a fellow for the National Security Institute, commandant of the Marine Corps National Legal Fellow Program, and a current JAG. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Professor Ali.
Thank you for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? All right, thank you. I'm excited to have you all here this afternoon. Look forward to an exciting discussion. With that, I would like to introduce our panel. So first to my right, we have Mr. Cully Stimson, who is the current Deputy Director of the Edward Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, a Senior Fellow and Manager of the National Security Law Program at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, he was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs, where he advised the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Robert Gates on global detention policies and practices. And before that, had retired judge advocate from, like me, the Sea Services, Navy counterpart, at the rank of captain. So give a round of applause for it. Next, we have Professor Dennis Fitzpatrick, decorated national security attorney, has worked with over every agency in the federal government, multiple agencies, was responsible for leading the investigation and prosecution of multiple terrorists, and yep, a round of applause. And next we have Dr. Mahmut Cenzig. Pronounce that one right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Exactly. Right now, Associate Professor and Research Faculty Member for the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at the Schar School of Policy next door. Author of multiple books, author of multiple journals and publications, has done extensive work with the European Union's U.S. agencies in the Middle East. Specializes in terrorism, organized crime, smuggling, terrorism financing, and trafficking. Please give a round of applause. Online, we have Professor Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera. My Spanish is not that good, but I hope I pronounced it pretty well. Is also a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government and co-director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center. Expertise in U.S. and Mexico relations, international security, migration studies, illicit networks. Also focuses on the phenomenon of human smuggling, trafficking, and migrants, and was one of the principal investigators on the research grant to study organized crime and trafficking in persons in Central America along the Mexico migration routes. So everyone give a round of applause. All right, with that being said, I want to jump into some of the questions. I'm looking forward to a very illuminating discussion. For the panel, I'd like you all to chime in on this first question. One, in regards to the designation of these cartel networks as foreign terrorist organizations, or specially designated global terrorist organizations. Has this been done before, and how does this change the paradigm for how we get after these criminal organizations now that they're designated terrorist organizations?
Go ahead.
Well, has it been done before? To this degree, the answer is no. I think this administration's effort is unique in that regard, of taking the terrorism designation and applying it to street gangs on the one hand, and then also in the same action, cartels. And I think what we need to do is actually divide them and look at them separately. But let's take a step back. It's not unusual and it's not unique to charge drug traffickers with terrorism offenses. There's actually a statute in Title 21, Title 21 960A, that if you are engaged in drug trafficking and you have knowledge or the intent that the proceeds of the drug trafficking will aid terrorism, then that's narco-terrorism. So there is a species of what's happening now that is in the pre-existing arsenal of crimes that we have. In fact, the first narco-terrorist prosecuted was a man by the name of Muhammad Khan, who was a Taliban leader, also an extraordinarily prolific heroin dealer. And he was prosecuted in the District of Columbia in 2008, served 2 terms, was convicted, sentenced to 2 life terms of imprisonment, and strangely enough, we recently traded him at the concluding days of the last administration to free 2 Americans who were held by the Taliban. So that life term of imprisonment became 17 years. So there's that precedent. But this initiative is new. It's a different take on addressing narcotics trafficking and violent crime. Like any aggressive policy decision, there are advantages, there are virtues, and there are disadvantages and negative aspects to it.
First off, thanks for having me. It's nice to be back at Mason, where I used to teach as an adjunct like Dennis. And like Dennis, I was an AUSA 2. And I think you all who are graduating, you're stuck with me because I'm going to be on your graduation certificate because I'm the rector of George Mason University. Which I guess technically means you're all bosses, but that's sort of ridiculous. It's easy to fall into the trap to think that this is just another effort to go after the so-called war on drugs. It's not. Most of you weren't alive on 9/11. I was. In fact, I was teaching here. And my company in New York City, Marsh McLennan, the first plane hit the first tower, hit Marsh, killed 295 of my colleagues. On that day, we lost almost 3,000 Americans. We rightly joined that war through an AUMF that Congress passed on the 18th of September. But if you look at the death toll, combined death toll and destruction of these cartels, and you consider, for example, that we have 100,000 fentanyl deaths a year in this country. It's the #1 killer of young people your age. This is entirely appropriate. This is not Nancy Reagan's Just Say No on steroids. This is enabling a series of statutory, executive, and what I would call intelligence apparatus to go after organizations that, to my mind, have been essentially equivalent of a terrorist organization for a long time. So it is the right thing to do. And I think when you get into further questions, we can get into some of the nitty-gritty of what additional tools that brings to the table. But I caution you not to fall into the trap like, you know, some of our libertarian friends would say, oh, it's just the war on terror, make it all legal, dude. This is not that. These are murderous thugs who enact essentially quasi-national power to supply drugs and death in our country.
Again, thank you, Mika'il, for the invitation. I think I just want to talk about the definitional issue. I think with this initiative, we are expanding terrorism definition. Because so far, for example, we are doing global terrorism database project at HR School, at Rec Center. And since 2018, we have recorded more than 58,000 terrorism incidents. And none of them was, including any cartel violence. But from this, I think after this initiative, we have just started the cartel maybe violence processing. I think the biggest impact is about its definition, because we are really expanding and stretching the terrorism inclusion criteria. Also, of course, it will have some big impacts on legal or maybe some policy implications. I think we will see more increased penalties and stricter sanctions after these designations. And maybe another one would be from the legal implications. So we will see, I think, more enhanced law enforcement powers and their surveillance and then the asset forfeitures. Of course, we will see some extraterritorial reach. So we may see in the future some military operations beyond U.S. borders. And beyond these legal implications, of course, there are some policy implications. I think we will have more discussions about in the future some diplomatic tensions because of sovereignty issues. Of course, another one would be about the sanctions. It may really strain some relations maybe in the future in the region. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I want to give Professor Cabrera a chance to jump in on that, and we'll move into some of the more nuance about it. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you on the National Security Law Journal for the invitation. I'm going to tell a little bit about my background because my background is a little bit different. I have been doing research on these organizations since the year 2009 when I arrived to Brownsville, Texas, and I wrote a book about Los Zetas. And the relationship between these organizations and the terrorist groups is still under investigation, and we need to understand what is the real capacity that these groups have to really affect the United States state. No matter how this is being defined, it's already an executive order. It's important to consider that the denomination is not enough. I think it's a good thing to deal with this in a more formal way, to follow the money, because this denomination at this point does not have a character of extraterritoriality, even though there have been some discussions about this. It's important to follow the money. It's important to conduct investigations of who are those in the United States who are supporting the activities of these groups. But we have to consider that this is not enough. Anti-narcotics operations in the United States and anti-narcotic cooperation programs with other countries, let's say in the Americas and beyond, have failed because the United States has targeted the groups outside its borders. What about the distribution mechanism? So that's why this denomination is important. Who is supporting these groups? But at the same time, we need to do more investigations about what are the channels of distribution of products that are sold by these organizations. So this is a good step moving forward. But this is just one action. We have to move forward and with further actions and investigations to really go to the bottom of this.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I want to follow along on that your answer with another line of questioning. You talked about we attack them outside of the United States, but what about in the United States? Can either of the panelists talk about maybe domestic or international legal issues that would need to be addressed here in the United States before we can go after those distribution networks? What challenges do they pose? Search and seizure, any other legal consideration or policy considerations we have to take into account to really get after these networks here in the United States?
Yeah, well, I think in some respect the answer is going to be you have to address it on a case-by-case basis, right? You're going to have to wait and see when the facts develop and then handle them that way. But I think sort of continuing with Professor Cabrera's point, she said follow the money. That's really, in my view, that's really the point of the designations under, Title 8 and Title 22, foreign terrorist organization, and specially designated global terrorist. The whole point of this is to get to choke off the money motivator and the money supply of large-scale drug trafficking organizations. If you designate the Sinaloa cartel or Los Zetas as foreign terrorist organizations or SDGTs, that necessarily means they become specially designated nationals under OFAC's sanctioning and blocking authorities. Banks take that very seriously. And I think with the Trump administration, one of the messages they're trying to send is enough talk, and we need to get everybody to buy in to this fentanyl problem. And that includes, elite banks and folks that sort of, try to rise above it all. If these drug trafficking cartels are designated terrorist organizations, that choking off the flow of money is a very, very powerful tool. And so I think at a broader policy level, that's the effect. Now, that's why I said at the beginning, I like to sort of distinguish between the cartels, which I think are serious and are wreaking, as Professor Stimson said, enormous havoc in the United States, particularly among young people. I mean, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that we are losing a good portion of generations, right? And it is largely taking place in forgotten communities across the country, right? Which is another underreported story. So I think it's a message from the administration that we're going to take this seriously, and it's a 360-degree look at the problem.
So if I could just pick up on Dennis's comment and put a finer point on it. Every executive order that every president signs has typically a cascading effect, right? This one is no different. And so what this domino did by pushing and designating these discrete these discrete drug cartels is to, for example, bring in directly the material support for terrorism statute, 18 U.S.C. 2339 Bravo. All right. Why does that do that? Because if you read Section A1, it talks about unlawful conduct, and it specifically mentions foreign terrorist organizations. And it starts with whoever knowingly provides material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization. So that not only puts the crosshairs on the cartels, who are now designated as FTOs, but anyone who's helping them. So that brings in what Guadalupe and Dennis are talking about. It's the banks. Because if you look at, I know you guys read law every day, civil penalty. Any financial institution that knowingly fails to comply with subsection A2 shall be subject to a civil penalty in an amount that is greater of $50,000 per violation. So the mafia, DTOs, cartels, it's all about the money. Greed is that green-eyed monster that mocked me that feeds upon, for those of you who are Shakespeare scholars. It's all about the money, right? But it also, for example, if you look at, speaking of the cascading effect, if you look at Pam Bondi's directive to all employees of DOJ, and then the DAG, the Deputy Number 2's memo called Operation Take Back in America, they now open it up to all 93 U.S. attorneys' offices to go after these organizations without running it through the National Security Division. So they're giving me more leash. That's another good effect. And then the other thing I would say is once you do what they did, and you treat them for what they really are, which are terrorist organizations, not Cheech and Chong selling a little spleef on the side of the street. These are terrorist organizations. Then you open up the whole intelligence toolkit. So Executive Order 12333, which I know Professor Jaffer talks about a lot, I'm sure you talk about, and FISA Section 702. All right? FISA Section 702 is the NSA's tool that allows us to surveil non-U.S. persons reasonably believed to be overseas. Not only getting the metadata, the time the call started, the time the call stopped, but the actual content. And so this allows you to feed what Dennis talked about on a case-by-case basis, whether you're using Title I, traditional criminal law tools, or intelligence gathering to snap up information to find out how to go after the finances. So this opens up a whole panoply of toolkits that weren't otherwise available prior to this happening.
And we'll jump a bit more into that. I'm going to give Professor.
In addition to that, I think also like the key challenges, we should talk about like overlapping jurisdictions and international law, because we know that under international law, transnational cartels are investigated as criminal enterprises. I think also another challenge would be about challenges in proving terrorism-related activities, because you need to prove these political models in maybe cartel cases in the US. This is maybe another challenge. But of course, we know that they are always profit-oriented. I think another one could be about extraditions, because other countries may not be on the same page with us, so we can have some maybe extradition issue and problems in the future. I think also lastly, another key challenge, maybe it can divert our attention from ideological groups to non-ideological groups like cartels, because we believe that today, according to our database, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they are not defeated organizations, so they are not, maybe they are confined to the regions they have been operating, but they are still very actively involved in terrorist activities. Also, maybe one key challenge about this, like it may divert our attention to, as I tried to explain, to more non-ideological groups and organizations.
Yeah, and I want to kind of piggyback off that. So you talk about resource constraints. Mr. Stimson talked about those extra intelligence authorities that may come in that help get after these newly designated foreign terrorist organizations. But can you speak on the actual practical support? Now that they've been designated foreign terrorist organizations, there's extra authorities that can come in to help get after these guys. So other than the legal authorities, you pretty much open up all the IC and maybe some military support. How do you think that will change the dynamic of getting after these foreign terrorist organizations?
Well, it'll get their attention, right? I mean, certainly it'll get their attention, right? And listen, that's helpful. It has, deterrence matters. And keeping the people who will harm this country on their heels has a great impact. Yeah, I think that opening up, broadening it out beyond just a strict law enforcement protocol is a good idea. Listen, sometimes policies get stale, right? And sometimes we need to sort of stir things up a little bit and try new things to solve sort of pernicious problems, right? And I don't think anyone would disagree that the large-scale drug problem and sort of the influx of fentanyl into this country has been a persistent problem. Mm-hmm. So it needs new ideas, it needs creativity and policy thinking, and I think that's at the root of this.
Devin, I want Professor Cabrera to chime in on that. How do you think changing it from a traditional law enforcement mission to now this kind of whole of government mission where you can bring in IC and possibly military support, how do you think that changes the dynamic?
This is very important. It's a great advancement to deal with this big problem that is transnational in its nature. However, there is a challenge to that I see in this whole of a government approach, which starts from the from the conceptualization of these groups. These foreign terrorist organizations right now are not really groups, they are networks. And that's the problem when I see how law enforcement and what in the narrative, because if these groups are monolithical, and that we're seeing, yes, we're seeing the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Sinaloa Cartel, and the Tren de Aragua, or MS-13. We're talking about, I mean, let's talk about drug trafficking organizations, not Tren de Aragua or MS-13, that also, some of them are connected with drug smuggling on, activities related to drug trafficking. Anyway, if we don't understand this, that we're talking about networks, we're gonna have a problem. I see a very big issue trying to really go after the money or following the money and the organizations or the people that are supporting these groups or networks. So this will become very, very complex. There's another thing that I would like to pose here. We're talking about banks, we're talking about actors that are supporting these groups. What about arm producing firms? That's another organization that we need to keep in mind here. Yes or no? I mean, I think, we're all in today, we're addressing this through the legal aspect of this. There are many things that have not been discussed that we need to discuss. But this whole of the government approach and to deal with the network itself, the network itself and those that are part of this network is a very, very big advance. It's important. But also in this network, as we already discussed, we have banks, we have private security firms, we have arm producing firms that we need to discuss further. What is the role and how to deal with the activities within this network?
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
So one of the comments that Professor Correa-Cabrera was alluding to was a case that was just argued in front of the Supreme Court where Mexico sued arms manufacturer here in the United States, essentially arguing that they're selling weapons, long rifles. Those are ending up in the hands of cartel members. The cartel members are using them to kill people. But if you guys remember back to torts, in the Paulsgraf case, there's a causation issue here, and I think if you listen to the questions that the justices were asking of the lawyer for Mexico, I don't think they're going to prevail, nor should they, in my opinion. There's a different concept that I think is behind some of this, and that is, when the president was a candidate and running for office, and people were talking about the invasion on the southern border and whether it technically met the definition of invasion, there was this, somewhere in the blogosphere and somewhere along the sidelines of these discussions was this sort of mental image of the U.S. military invading Mexico to go after, the cartels. And I want to sort of step back from that for a moment to remind you of a legal concept and regime in international law that was really front and center on the Navy SEALs raid of the compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, to get Osama bin Laden. Ashley Deeks, among other legal scholars, has written about the unwilling or unable test. And in Pakistan, we decided as a matter of law, the country did, that the country of Pakistan, and the ISI in particular, was unwilling or unable to cough up the whereabouts or assist with the raid to capture or kill bin Laden, right? So that's not a hard and fast rule, but it is an international law concept. And I'd be curious to hear Guadalupe's comments on this because she spent so much time studying this and writing about this. Some people say Mexico's a failed state. I don't think it is a failed state, but I'm not an expert on Mexico. Some elements of the army are corrupt. Some elements of the police force, national police force are corrupt. But I don't think we have decided as a matter of law that they're unwilling or unable as a sovereign country to try to solve the drug trafficking problem such that we could legitimately send the 82nd Airborne or the Marines across a sovereign border to go after the cartels. And so in these actions here, you see actions short of that, I think, hopefully they're very successful at that, but I don't think you should be thinking that we're just going to send the Marines in to get them, because that would be a very different line to cross, and I don't think this administration is considering that at all.
Thank you, Professor Cenzig and Cabrera. I would love to hear your thoughts based on your research.
I think also it is one option to deploy the military right after these designations. But after seeing our experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, I don't think I don't know how much we should be relying on the military option like this when targeting these cartels. I think also at the same time it can be seen a sovereignty issue. So we have seen some Mexican government people being against U.S. maybe likely maybe this military option in the future. Of course, we should be like on the same page with the Mexican government. Otherwise, if there is no collaboration, I don't think that we will be effectively addressing this issue. So this military option may bring us more unintended consequences, like breaking our ties and or pushing this issue to the sovereignty issue area. So I think maybe we should be really careful about this option in the future.
Okay, I want to go to Professor Cabrera, then I'll get to Professor Fitzpatrick. Professor Cabrera, what do you think? Is there an unwilling and able on the behalf of Mexico, or is there something else that we can do?
It is a very interesting discussion here that we need to also understand from different lenses. There is impunity and corruption in Mexico as it is in the United States. Lots of impunity and corruption that has been able to, and the protection brackets in Mexico have made possible that these groups distribute drugs and participate in other activities. But as I say, we're talking about networks. Not all of those networks are connected with drug trafficking. And not all of this part is part of a national security interest of the United States. These groups need to be dealt with first in the case of Mexico, and Mexico has to deal with that problem. Is Mexico capable of doing that? Yes. But Mexico needs to address its impunity and corruption issue. At the same time, the United States needs to address its impunity and corruption issue with regards to when the drugs are received in the United States and distributed in the United States. We're talking about drug trafficking. And the groups that operate in Mexico, not all of them are centered on drug trafficking activities, even though we're talking about the Sinaloa cartel or the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Some cells of these groups dedicate only to extortion, and they affect Mexicans, not the U.S. population, and they are not connected to drug trafficking. Some of them steal steal gas, dedicate to human smuggling, and they start to specialize. So we need to address things in a more, the way this has been defined, and sometimes the discussion is only centered on drugs and only center of national security interest of the United States, but these groups are more than that. So we need to refine our discussion, our conceptualization of these groups, and identify the groups in a different way. Conceptualizing them as networks, and understand what part of the network really is affecting the United States people and the United States state and society. So Mexico can deal with this and should deal with this because it affects Mexicans and its relationship with the United States, as El Salvador did. El Salvador was considered to some extent by some as a failed state. Nayib Bukele, was able to deal with the problem very, very quickly. And one of the things that was important is not like creating prisons and sending people inside, but really addressing the issue of corruption and impunity within government structures.
Yep, thank you for that. So I want to get to Professor Fitzpatrick. Given your experience on actually investigating and prosecuting terrorists, how amicable do you think the Mexican government would be to extraditing some of these leaders from the plazas and from the cartels and their various networks back to the United States to actually face our justice system, or do you think they would be more willing to just support to prosecute them there in Mexico?
Well, I think it changes over time, right? think we're heading into a period where the relationship is actually improving with Mexico. But, you know, acknowledging that it can change quickly. The Mexican government has extradited numerous drug traffickers. I mean, Chapo Guzman, very, very complicated case, right? There was some corruption involved with his case, certainly. He was incarcerated, he escaped, however, the military recaptured him and they quickly extradited him to the United States for prosecution. Yeah, I think you will see cooperation from Mexico and Central and South American countries to further this. You know, the whole question of, you know, do we want, you know, we have to be judicious in who we are going to prosecute, and we also need to make sure that we have a strong case, right? So those are factors as well. We can't do these things, you know, there's sort of the public perception, and then there's actually the everyday work of developing a case and satisfying yourself that you have, you know, the quality and the quantity of evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's more difficult than I think the general public understands. But the last point is on the whole issue of sort of relationships with our southern neighbors. You know, again, I think part of the dynamic here is to send a message to the Mexican government, the Colombian government, Honduran government, that we're really, Venezuelan government, we're really serious about this. And it sort of serves as a wake-up call to these governments as well.
I was in Bogota, Colombia, a few weeks ago, visiting the former CNO, Chief Naval Operations, and it was interesting because, you know, back in the day when we were coming up in the ranks, the cartels in Colombia owned the country essentially. I mean, it was in Medellin, and I'm sure Guadalupe probably has studied that as well and could speak more eloquently than I can about it. Today, it's a thriving metropolitan of 12 million people. There's no drug issues going on at the scale it was, not even close. And so it's interesting, if you read A.G. Bondi's February 5th memo to DOJ, she essentially says, quote, under Section 1, for leaders and managers of cartels and TCOs, the most serious, readily provable offenses under DOJ's general charging policy will typically include capital crimes, and then she lists all of them. But then she says, and this is interesting, on the other hand, under the total elimination policy, they want to get rid of all cartels, nice thought, it will often be prudent to pursue removal from the United States of a low-level investigative target without immigration status, rather than incurring the time and resource costs associated with criminal prosecution. So you see this calibration issue going on. And in the pure terrorism context, the ideologically driven terrorism context that my colleague is talking about, Al-Qaeda, some members of the Afghan Taliban, associated forces, and ISIS, they're completely ideologically driven, and oftentimes surveillance of them, and only surveillance of them to find out various things like funding and disruption is the best option. And prosecution is oftentimes the worst option.
Thank you. I really want to hear, we're moving fast and we're almost to question and answer. I saw your hand go up, but I just want to get to this last one specifically for the two professors that are researching at CHAR. Based off the history of these organizations, based off your own research, what do you think the risk is for escalating, or what type of reaction they would have to their leaders being captured, extradited, prosecuted, or potentially eliminated by, like we talked about, military or law enforcement? What do you think their reaction to all this? Do they go underground and preserve their money and try the best way, or do they attack U.S. personnel in diplomatic facilities or U.S. civilians? What do you think?
I believe that maybe it may provoke some retaliations from the Mexican cartels. Of course, I have just mentioned about some maybe military options and maybe some unintended consequences. So it will be like always like an option for Mexican cartels to retaliate. Of course, maybe targeting some maybe Americans in Mexico, just to give a message to maybe the U.S. government. Of course, they can be good guys in Mexico, and maybe they can be seen like the victims, so they can get more recruits. I think if they may provoke retaliation, I believe this is risky, just to deal with this cartel issue, because they are really very powerful, and I think as far as I know, there are more than 2,000 members, like the cartel members, and Jalisco is the leading one. I think with more than 40,000 maybe members. Also, they are a global network. I don't think that maybe these designations or like our approaches, counterterrorism approaches, will be bringing us some good results in the short term. Of course, like some unintended consequences of, or like provoking retaliation. So these are some issues maybe on the table which we can see in the future.
Okay, Professor Cabrera, if they retaliate, what do you think their calculus is based off of your studies of, hey, if we target a U.S. citizen, we may open ourselves up for some U.S. military action against us. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the capacity of these groups is not as some people think it is. The capacity of these so-called cartels, or I call like, transnational crime networks, because basically they don't necessarily connect with drug trafficking. They have diversified very quickly and very evidently. And they survive, as I mentioned in the beginning, because of the protection from different levels of government, Mexican government. So if you address, the capacity that they have depend on these protection brackets and these protection schemes. If we address this issue, if Mexico addresses this issue, and the United States address the issue of demand for drugs and the capability that the networks that distribute drugs in the United States, if we do these things at the same time, and then there's a serious effort to follow the money, to deal with those that support these networks or parts of this network, we're gonna deal with this. They're not going to. They're not. They have arms. They have military capacity. Of course they do. They are armed civilians, but their capacity will definitely can be dismantled if the protection is also lessened, and there is a motivation by the two governments to deal with this on both sides of the border.
Yeah, and
So
small arms are big.
I don't think that the retaliation will be massive if the U.S. and Mexico, if the United States and the Mexican government go after them. Of course, sometimes we think or we analyze this as if the state and these criminal groups are different, but the government protection of these groups is also forms a part of it. So there is a possibility to pressure from the United States to prosecute, to investigate, to deal with money laundering, which is another thing that we need to be talking about. The capacity that they have has to do with the availability of arms too. And if you close that possibility in a certain way, which I understand, there are many complexities about the arms trade issues, but we will be in a good path. And I believe that at this point, with everything that is happening with terrorists, with the threat of tariffs, with a new world order, Mexico's government understands what they have to do. And in my view, the new administration of Mexico is collaborating, and with good luck, these protection brackets will be dismantled.
All right, thank you. Yes, so we have about 5 more minutes before we have question and answer time, so I want to get to one last question. So we talked about the judiciary, right? We talked about prosecution. We talked about the executive bringing in the intel community and military, law enforcement elements. What about Congress? What have they done? What are they doing? What do we think they should be doing? What role do they play in this new paradigm opened up from designating these cartel organizations and foreign terrorists, especially designated terrorist organizations?
Congress has delegated all their authority to the executive. That's the answer. Congress is missing in action, and Congress has been missing in action for a long time. We're in an environment now where we have and these things wax and wane, right? But we're in an environment now where We have a strong executive, we have a strong judiciary, and we have a very weak Congress. In part, we have a weak Congress because we're a very divided country, and that's just a natural consequence of our division.
Although I think the pendulum's slightly swinging back with the court's decision in Loper, Bright, and Relentless. And I think the next target on deference will be our deference, AUER deference, not to get in the weeds on admin law. But you're right. I mean, for example, there have been over 40 authorizations for use of military force in our country's history, only 5 declarations of war and 11 conflicts. I've written and testified about this. Do you realize that the authorization for use of military force from 1991 to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait is still on the books? Do you realize that the 2002 Iraq AUMF is still on the books? And we haven't relied on that at all as a matter of law. And the only one that we're relying on for these types of things for Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and associated forces, the post 9/11 2001 AUMF. So to Dennis's point, Congress needs to get back in the business of legislating, but the overturning of Chevron deference is going to put pressure on them to actually write laws with teeth.
I would say we need more oversight and accountability. I think about the current counterterrorism, maybe policies and the strategies in the border. Of course, there is a big definitional issue, and so far, I don't think there is any terrorism definition covering this cartel violence. So maybe we might need some new laws in the future also that is covering cartel violence as one part of terrorism.
Awesome. So I think Professor Bird, did you want to chime in on Congress's role, or we can roll straight to question and answers?
Just wanted to say something about Mexico, because this is a transnational issue that is going to be addressed by different governments, right? So here, what happened in Mexico, just for everybody to kind of like also think about this, there's a concentration of power again into one party. You know, the previous party state regime, the PRI regime, is kind of like renewing itself through the judicial reform in Mexico. So there's a concentration. The lack of checks and balances might be useful for Mexico too, to address this issue in a more relevant way. I know it sounds a little bit contradictory, but one of the main problems in Mexico to deal with this issue was exactly, the division of powers that created some tensions. And today, with the judicial reform, that it also has its many negative aspects, but it's going to make easier the address of the issue from the Mexican perspective.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. So I want to open it up for question and answers. We have a couple minutes. Right here at the front.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the immigration law aspect of this that was brought up a little bit. Because, so presumably a lot of these cartel members are not U.S. citizens, so they would be deportable simply by virtue of whatever crimes they commit in the United States. And I saw this happen like a few days ago with a woman who was like a fentanyl trafficker. So what's the advantage for our national security interests in pursuing terrorism-related charges as opposed to just deporting them?
So I think you're referencing A.G. Bondi's memo to the department, and I think to reiterate what she said, they're focusing on the leaders, not Billy Bob or Susie Q, who's coming across the border, he was here illegally, and maybe he's a low-level dealer. So they're going to go after, and have been going after and targeting the leadership, and she clearly says in her memo that deporting somebody who has a final order of removal, which is a process that takes a long time, way too long, is the right approach. What's interesting is there's an interesting parallel. We had 103,000 detainees since the war on terror started. 75,000 in Iraq, 25,000 in Afghanistan, 779 at Gitmo. Today we have none in Iraq, none in Afghanistan, and about a couple, 15 or 16 down at Gitmo. This is the only war we've ever fought where we let the opposing enemy forces go during the war. And so ask yourself this, and I'm not suggesting an answer to it, does it make sense to send back low-level members of the DTO that you can deport because they're here illegally and just go after the high-level guys, because aren't you just reinforcing the DTO? I don't know the answer to that.
There's a lot in that question, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds of sort of actually prosecuting and trying cases, but it's in some respects it's wishful thinking to say we're just going to go after the leaders and we're going to deport all the low-level folks, because in reality you need the low-level folks to prosecute the leaders, right? It's all tied together. The way you prosecute leaders of drug trafficking organizations is you flip the lower-level people, right? So I appreciate Attorney General Bondi's message, but in reality, and I've existed under a lot of different policy initiatives by many, many different attorney generals, and you know, we pay respect to them, and then we do what we have to do to prosecute our cases. Yeah, I'll just leave it
I want
at
to
that.
get to the.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
you go ahead.
Okay, I had a question in the back. Oh, in the front. Go ahead.
Yep.
So I have two questions. First question, this is open to everyone. I was just wondering if you guys could give us a little bit more in terms of this executive order and the cascading effects, how it'll affect our capacity, because one thing was mentioned that maybe like we focus all our attention right now, especially in law enforcement intelligence apparatus, on ideological groups. Do we have the capacity to turn a lot of that towards this? Do we need that? And are we going to see potentially a large expansion of those areas? And then I can ask my second question.
Let me take that one first. So from the DOJ perspective, right, and I think it's a very good question. I meant to reference it earlier. I don't think you're going to see a drain on resources, actually. And I don't think, to address your question as well, I don't think you're going to see this vast expansion of prosecuting terrorism cases with drug traffickers. I really think the point of the initiative is what we've discussed earlier. It's money and it's politics and policy, right? And politics in the good sense is getting people's attention. I think that's the emphasis. With respect to actual boots on the ground prosecution, you know, the fact is that we have plenty of statutes to prosecute these people already. And the terrorism statutes will just be tag-on charges, right? It'll end up being negotiated away. And, you know, we have kingpin statutes. We have continuing criminal enterprise. We have racketeering. We have violence in aid of racketeering. I mean, we have a whole host of criminal statutes already on the books. So we actually don't need, from a criminal prosecution standpoint, the material support statutes. We don't need them. But that's not to say that it doesn't have beneficial effects. Again, stemming the flow of money and policy and getting other countries' attention.
Yeah, so just real quickly, specifically for Professor Correa-Cabrera, you mentioned that you don't love the conception of how we have it right now, just drug cartels, that all these groups are merely drug cartels, and that you'd rather perceive them as networks that have diversified their criminal enterprises. Can you speak a little bit more as to why that's important? And are you saying that we need more, like different types of regulations or statutes to address that, or what's the end effect of that?
Yeah, this is a very, very good question, and I'm writing a book on that as we speak. You know, if you conceptualize, if you denominate a group as a foreign terrorist organization, you kind of assume that there is a concentration of functions, there's the leadership, there's specific leadership you should go after. These groups, the way that I see them, I have done a lot of work on the ground in Mexico. I'm Mexican, I'm Mexican citizen. I have a double citizenship. And if you conceive this way, if you don't understand, for example, that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is not necessarily a group with a specific leadership, and Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes, alias El Mencho, is really, we don't know where he is, but if we're really talking about a criminal franchise, we're not going to prosecute these things correctly. These people correctly, and these activities are not going to be stopped because you assume that everything that has the brand of the the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, they acquire a brand and they commit extortion or kidnap people, extract rents from Mexicans that are not necessarily related to drug trafficking or activities. There's a whole misunderstanding of these groups. If the prosecutors in the United States, the investigators, and the general public understand this, we're never going to deal with the problem because we're talking about multiple illicit businesses. And some of these businesses are just affecting Mexicans. Where I'm going here is that focusing on narcotics, focusing on drugs, is not going to help us here because these groups are not just dedicated to drugs, and they include different groups. They include those who transport the drugs, some of them who produce the drugs, some of them that are just protecting these groups like gangs that form part of these networks. Some people that are in the illicit markets, like working for transportation companies and also providing some services to the cartels, the drug cartels. I don't like. It's not that I don't love the way it is. I think it's wrong. First of all, they're not cartels. They're not oligopolies because supposedly they fight among each other, right? They don't sit down in a table and decide they're going to produce a certain amount of like drugs or fentanyl or whatever. They supposedly fight among themselves for the control of a plaza.
And that's an interesting
I think
point.
there's a fundamental mistake here conceptualizing these groups as organizations when they are networks.
Yeah, and Professor Cabrera, this is the moderator. That's an interesting point because a lot of people don't know that because of the franchise makeup, there's actually a lot of infighting between them. It's not this monolithic group with one leader at the top. We're running short on time, so I want to give Professor Sis.
I just think this, okay, that's fine. So maybe for your first question, the capacity question, if I go back our database, since 2018, we have recorded more than 58,000 terrorism cases. But in the US, it is not more than 100. I think our data is showing that we are not doing too much terrorism investigations in the US. So, and this is an important point. I just wanted to add it.
I'll just make a couple quick comments. One is, I'm reminded of what some of the top Al-Qaeda people used to tell our interrogators when they were being lawfully interrogated. And they would say, they had a bunch of similar exact favorite quotes. One of their favorite quotes was, "You have watches, we have calendars." In other words, they're going to take the long view. And so to the professor's comment about, okay, they're not ideologically driven, but they're driven by the greed of power and money, that greed is not going to go away. Secondly, to Professor Correa-Cabrera's comment, I thought it was very perceptive, no doubt correct, that these are sort of loose associations. We have a tremendous capability in that area because that's what Al-Qaeda was, especially in Afghanistan. And so they didn't walk around with their Al-Qaeda card, hey I'm Al-Qaeda Bob, I'm Al-Qaeda Fred. They weren't readily identifiable. But if you consider the fact that 60 to 70% of the president's daily brief every morning comes from 702 collection, when you turn that spigot, when you turn that apparatus on these cartels, I don't know what percentage today the president's PDB has from this, but it has to be more than zero, right? So you're going to see who's talking to who. You're going to see who's calling who. You're going to see who's emailing who. You're going to read those things, and that's what the intelligence apparatus does. So we're going to have more information now than we had before, and information is power, and that helps.
We're gonna get the gentleman here, and then we'll get you, and then I think I'm getting the. Go ahead, sir.
So just first and foremost, thank you guys so much for this conversation. I think critics of the war on terror, one of their biggest concerns is that it seems to never be, it's never ending. And so I'm curious with that understanding, I think today we've raised sort of what the problems are, and no doubt there's pernicious death and harm that's occurring because of these transnational criminal networks, and especially because of their characteristic as networks. How do you see applying these tools that we've talked about today in terms of the end result of solving these problems? Is it one of those things where critics are right that it's similar to the war on terror where it's never ending, or is it more that we target the biggest harm factors and sort of just put the institutions in place to minimize these networks, especially considering once you get rid of one, if there's infighting, you may have a power vacuum and things of that nature.
What does it look like in the end? What does victory look like?
Listen, I think that's an existential question, right? So I don't know if there's a perfect answer. What I do know is that there's an obligation on the government to protect its citizens, right? And so the war will end when we stop facing harm and threats to our national security. You tell me when that is. I mean, I don't know. So what we need is effective, thoughtful, I would argue, appropriately aggressive measures to protect the American people. And there's a read and react quality to the policy making as well. You have to stay abreast of developing threats when other threats are diminishing, to your point, that there are factions and there are shifts in the methodology of bad actors. So I think it's going to be a consistent thing.
What I can say is that I think so far the world has failed effectively countering terrorism. For example, in our database again, we are recording every year 8,000 terrorism incidents. And every year more than 20,000 people are losing their lives. I think no one can stop so far. Of course, it's a complex issue, like political grievances, economic grievances, there is everything on the table. And just looking at how we have responded to maybe this ideological group, so I don't think that maybe we will see some effective results in the fight against the cartels, even after their designations.
Professor Cabrera, what does victory look like? What does it look like in the end? Or is it, can it be achieved?
Yeah. This is a great question. I believe this is a direction this is an action in the right direction to deal with the reporters, to follow the money. Of course, going after the question here is, should we continue with the kingpin strategy, which is a different thing than this denomination. This denomination does not have extraterritorial capacities, and it deals with an aspect that needs to be dealt with, and the focus on these groups as foreign terrorist groups have its good things. I was always very concerned about this happening, but it happened, and I'm trying to look at the good things, and this is good. But your question is, should we continue with the kingpin strategy? Should we continue going after leaders that really do not exist in that sense? Because cartels do not exist in the sense that we are thinking of them. And if we go after El Mencho or after El Mayo Zambada or after the kids of El Mayo Zambada and the family, and we continue with this strategy, we're never going to address this problem. We have to follow the money, and we have to deal with these, fighting corruption and impunity, and dismantling the networks, in collaboration. So I'm just not very sure that continue going after leaders is going to solve the problem. It has not solved the problem since the beginning of the war on drugs in the last century.
Thank you. With the last minute left.
To me, the answer falls into three buckets, and I don't pretend to have the answers. One, it's a philosophical question, and I'll leave that to the philosophers. It's a political question because political power is evanescent, and it goes away after a period of time, so we'll have to decide how long this administration or the following administration wants to continue this drumbeat. And then it's an economics question, and I'm reminded of the scene in My Cousin Vinny, when they're cooking the grits. And he goes, does the law of physics cease to exist on your stove? Remember that scene? Yeah. Well, this is supply and demand, right? And Guadalupe nailed it early. I mean, until the demand signal lessens, the suppliers are going to find a way, somehow, whether they put the drugs in a cow, which apparently they're doing now, or they put it in boats, or they fly it in, or they put it in dead groupers, or whatever they do, they're going to get it. And so I think this will stem the tide somewhat. It will have all sorts of collateral consequences, some positive, some negative, but I don't think the question is capable of being answered.
Thank you. I know I had one more question, but we are out of time. We can save some time for afterwards. If you don't have a law school topic for any paper you're writing, you heard lots of stuff, especially my students in my seminar. Take notes. Everyone join me in giving them a round of applause.
Good job.
Next meeting.